Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here in Santa Maria, talking with you tonight about this concept that I created and coined the term for about 5 years ago now, called missing middle housing. And I think that one of the primary reasons that this concept has caught on and is being utilized so broadly actually across the country now is that it's given community members, decision makers, builders, a different way to talk about the need for housing choices without using scary terms like density. We're going to increase density in your neighborhood. We're going to bring multifamily housing into your neighborhood, right? These are really bad terms that we as planners and architects use a lot. That part of the reason we came up with this concept is let's just take a step back and talk about sort of the wide variety of housing choices that a lot of our pre-1940s neighborhoods provided, that we need to figure out a way to reintroduce back into our existing neighborhood fabrics as well as in our new neighborhood fabrics to respond to the growing demand for these diverse choices. And it's a little bit ironic, but this concept actually was sort of initially tested in my practice with a project that we worked on with Santa Barbara County almost 20 years ago now. And in a way that it was actually for a master plan and new zoning for Isla Vista, right? And the place that I'm sure all of you are very aware of. The citizen advisory group came to us like before we even got started, sort of the second we stepped in the room, and said, we don't want any housing greater than 17 dwelling units per acre in our community. And it took us really off guard because number one, like, what does 17 dwelling units per acre, like what is good about everything below 17 dwelling units per acre? And why is it 17 and not 17.25 or 18 or 16.5, right? It's a number. And so we had to step back and sort of try to get behind, well, what is it about, like what are they thinking they want in their community beyond a number? So we actually took them on a walking tour of downtown adjacent Santa Barbara neighborhoods, and we saw really a wealth of really great housing choices. We saw bungalow courts, little houses, oriented on a green space. We saw fourplexes. We saw mansion apartments, buildings that look like a big house that happen to have 10 units in it. And then we came to this courtyard apartment building, right? Many of you have probably seen this, one of my favorite buildings. And they said, this is exactly what we want in Isla Vista. If you can do a master plan and rewrite our zoning, at the time we're doing a form-based code, it's just an alternative approach to thinking about zoning, that will get us this, we will support the project. And so I do the nerdy thing that I do as an architect and planner, urban designer, and I go around and I count the meters, and then I go up to the front and I count the doorbells just to reassure, and I said, well, by the way, this apartment, this beautiful courtyard apartment building is almost 50 dwelling units per acre. All right, and so it completely changed the conversation to a point where, okay, well, let's talk about what it is about this courtyard apartment, that bungalow court down the street, those fourplexes that enable them to integrate seamlessly into a neighborhood that might be 80% single family houses, but they sit right next to it and they're a good neighbor. And so that really changed the conversation in that community, and it's been sort of building upon that. And I think for this group, I wanted to make the point, especially since you're sort of focused on economic development, that this isn't just about building housing, but it's about creating places. And a really, really good friend of mine who's works for the state of Michigan Housing and Economic Development Department just came back from a international conference on economic development, the International Economic Development Council, and said the number one defined priority in this group at the end of their conference was reinforcing placemaking as the most important economic development tool. So just something, whether you're a small town like Guadalupe, thanks Mayor for the proper pronunciation there, or Santa Maria or Paso Robles or San Luis Obispo, right? Placemaking needs to be a really, really strong priority in your economic development strategy. And so it's a really important part of this conversation. So what is the problem? Here are some of the reasons that you as decision makers, as business owners, as planners, urban designers, architects, need to be thinking about what's the problem. There's a tremendous mismatch between the types of housing and living that the market wants and what we are providing. Just a quick example. This is Chris Leinberger, who's from the Brookings Institute. There is currently, in any community you go into the country, and I would actually I think that it's probably a much bigger gap here in Santa Maria, is there's a 20 to 35% gap between the people in the market who want to live in a walkable urban neighborhood and what is being provided. So, right, 20 to 30% gap. You can imagine that's a pretty simple supply and demand equation. So the places that you're providing walkable urban living are in really high demand and the supply is low. So guess where the prices go, right? Through the roof. So we need to be building more of this. And if you look at who are the primary buyers, right? The millennials and the boomers, right? There's a convergence right now. What the millennials want, the boomers need: walkability, less reliance on the car. 59% of millennials, this is from a survey, are looking for housing types in walkable urban locations. And 27% of boomers are looking for housing in walkable urban locations, right? Those are some big numbers, right? And we as sort of policymakers and builders sort of need to be responding to this, right? Then there's also a tremendous shift in household demographics, and some of these numbers are really staggering, right? Currently, 30% of all households are single-person households. Now imagine that, 30%. In some places, it's actually larger. And we've been building housing for this kind of 1950s Leave It to Beaver nuclear family, the mother, the father, the 3 or 4 kids. And now we have a third of our population that has households that have one person. So imagine the impact that has on the types of housing that we need to be providing in our communities. It's the demand and the need is very, very different now. By 2025, 75 to 85% of all households will not have children. Right? Think about the impact of that demographic shift on the types of housing and the types of communities we need to be providing. Just really, really quite staggering. And then there's a growing affordability gap. And right, I don't need to reinforce this that much here in this area in California in general, but by 2025, over 15 million people in the United States households will be spending over half of their income on housing. And if you don't know, that the average is between 25 and 30% of annual income spent on housing. And this large group of people are going to be spending over half their income. And that doesn't include transportation costs, right? Because a lot of people are driving till they qualify. So there's a huge cost of transportation that's not even sort of linked into that. And then there's sort of obstacles, whether it be process or rules, regulations. And what we found through our work is that zoning is one of the biggest barriers for missing middle housing. A system that's almost 100 years old and hasn't been rethought in that 100 years. And so, right, what our zoning has produced in a lot of the infill conditions is, we call these dingbat apartments, right? And you can find a variation of these in any community you go into. And at some point in our histories, a lot of these downtown neighborhoods got upzoned, but the tools weren't sharp enough to get us the right things. And so we got these results. And I think this is what started this knee-jerk reaction in communities about any housing type that's not a single-family detached house, or that we call multifamily or higher density housing types. And so just created very incompatible infill, right? And then we're building new sort of medium density housing in really sort of far out locations, sort of at the edge of 2 arterials, where your general plan had a color that was orange and it said medium density housing. And it's an isolated environment. And it's a type of place that people only live in if that's the only place they can afford. The second they can afford something else, they will move. And so we need to get better about creating new housing choices in these walkable urban environments that aren't isolated like this. I call this density without amenity, because usually if you're living in a more dense environment, there are amenities that you're getting in exchange for maybe less space, but this is not that. So what is missing middle housing? So this diagram on the left-hand side are single-family detached houses. On the right-hand side are 3, 4, 5, 6-story apartments or mixed-use buildings. Right? We figured out how to plan for, regulate, and build single-family. Like we've figured that out. We're doing a great job of that. Over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, builders have figured out the higher intensity sort of urban types. It's all these housing types in the middle. It's the duplex, it's the fourplex, it's the cottage court, it's the townhouse, it's the live-work unit that we have not been building. We've been building very, very few of these types over the course of the last 60 to 70 years. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mentioned zoning. There's a lot of neighborhood opposition to anything that's not single family. From a financing standpoint, once you get over 4 units, the financing becomes much more complicated. Impact fees, right? If you have an impact fee of $40,000, it's going to be really hard to justify building a small cottage court unit. And that list goes on. And so part of this discussion is how do we remove those barriers? If you take one concept away from this presentation tonight, is that missing middle housing types never get larger than the scale of a house. They just happen to have multiple units poured into that form. And so that's how it becomes compatible, or is compatible, with single-family neighborhoods even. So, right, Santa Barbara has great examples. Sacramento has great examples, right? Any pre-1940s neighborhood, whether it's in California or other parts of the country, has great mixes of these types. San Luis Obispo has great examples, right? You just kind of have to stop and look for them because they fit right into the neighborhoods. And so let me go through the types here. Side-by-side duplex, right? Pretty straightforward, 2 units put together, no bigger than the scale of a house. I don't like to talk about densities just because I think they're fairly irrelevant in terms of housing conversation, but if you're a planner or you kind of like to understand this, these types generate a density of about 19 to 20 units per acre on a typical lot size. So for some of you, that's really high density. Others, that's kind of at the lower end. But then we have the stacked duplex. You go in the door on the right, up a flight of stairs, and you have the entire upper floor as your apartment or your flat. If you go on the left-hand side, that's the entry to the ground floor unit. So 2 units, one on top of the other, right? Scale of a house, and once again, these generate densities of about 20 units per acre if you're keeping track of this. But one of my favorite types, this is on a street that I ride my bike by this type on my way to work every day. The street's primarily single family. It just happens a few of these kind of nicely tucked in, and you wouldn't even notice these weren't single family homes unless you stop to take a closer look at them. Then the cottage court. Many of you have probably seen these. I know there's a handful of variations of these in your downtown neighborhoods. I saw some of them this afternoon. Series of small, typically about 600 or 700 square foot cottages around a shared green space, usually only 1 story. These typically generate densities of up to 35 units per acre. So if you're a developer, you're thinking, wow, that's a pretty good yield, right? As a community member, you're thinking, wow, I might not mind living in that place with this great shared community space. And the densities are pretty high. Like when cities are working on their general plans and they allocate a density of like 30, 40 units per acre, they're not typically thinking about small scale housing like this. They're usually thinking about big apartment buildings. So it's a way to start thinking differently about this. And it's just an aerial view here, right? 6 small cottages with a 2-story piece at the back. It's a pretty typical layout. Then there's the accessory dwelling unit, carriage house, whatever you might want to call it. Just a really important part of this conversation about providing choice, whether it be with infill in your downtown neighborhoods. This is a great project that was developed up in Hercules, California on the former dynamite plant. It was built by Lion Homes. A lot of the homes were all alley loaded, and I'd say majority of them had this accessory dwelling unit over the garage space. Hugely, hugely successful. Then there's a fourplex, right? Looks and feels like a house. It has 2 units on the ground floor and 2 units on the upper floor, right? Just these generate a density of about 30 units per acre. Really interesting aspect of this was in Dallas, Texas. We did a documentation exercise with the group. The building right next to it was the exact same size. The architecture was a little bit different, same width, same height, same depth, same size lot. But instead of 4 one-bedroom apartments, it had 8 studio apartments in the exact same building, so it generated a density of almost 70 units per acre, right? And this is not what you think about anybody when you sort of, you're thinking about densities of like 60 or 70 units per acre. So just, it's a really different way to think about these housing choices. And we've been, over the course of the last 4 years, developing a set of the translation of the historic examples into new plans and new designs for sort of modern day living. And so it's not really that hard to do. It's just a really fun exercise. And the multiplex small. So there's townhouses. I know that a lot of markets have started to accommodate the townhouse. We've seen a lot of really bad variations of the townhouse, so I tell communities just to be really careful about what you ask for and make sure you regulate them appropriately. And then back to that courtyard apartment building, just a really great sort of at the upper end of this missing middle housing type. So where do you find missing middle? In the light yellow are the missing middle types, and historically they were just blended. We call it blended density. They were blended into a block that had single family homes on it. So maybe 15 to 20% of a block will have missing middle housing types integrated with single family detached houses, right? It's kind of the opposite of this, which is the way we develop today, which is in pods, right? You have smallest lot single family here, across the street behind another wall you have the slightly larger single family lot. On the other side of the arterial you have the medium density, and then sort of across the sound wall on the other side you have the highest of the density that's allowed in your general. You can kind of see where the zoning map changes on these projects, but it's kind of the antithesis of that because you're blending these types and these densities very carefully. Great project just up the road in King City, right? It blends single family houses that are about 10 units per acre, townhouses at 18 units per acre, Muse House that was 15, but more importantly it integrates this great little 2-story courtyard apartment building that has a 30 dwelling unit per acre yield, right in the same block as those single family houses, right? They're just house scale multi-unit buildings. A lot of cities just have different corridors that historically have had collections of these missing middle along those corridors. And just a few characteristics, a few of the important characteristics here. Walkable context, whether that be a downtown adjacent neighborhood, or a new neighborhood like the one in King City created in a greenfield area that is a walkable neighborhood, right? And this is back to that growing demand for the boomers and the millennials for walkable urban living. And so the developers we see that are providing this are knocking it out of the park in every market that we're working in. Lower perceived density, I think that's pretty straightforward, right? These look and feel like a house, they just happen to have multiple units in it. Right, this is, right, looks like a big house, has 3 units in it, right? You would never guess that. It's integrated into it. This is a new community called Daybreak up in Salt Lake City, a great new master plan project. Smaller, well-designed units, right? Think about those statistics about single-person households, baby boomers downsizing, and we're talking small at like 600, 700 square feet. We're not talking like 1,200 or 1,400. There's a huge demand for this size of housing. A good friend of mine owns the cottage company. They're doing pocket neighborhoods, little cottage courts up in the Seattle. Her number one sort of type of buyer are single women. Like 80% of her buyers are single women. They buy little 600 square foot, beautifully designed sort of gems of little cottages that share courtyard space. Fewer off-street parking spaces, right? None of you have controversial conversations about parking in your communities, right? The reason that this is possible is you have to start with the premise that you're trying to create a walkable urban place. And that this is a hard conversation to have in every community, but it's absolutely necessary to be having. We found that in markets like here in northern Santa Barbara County, if you're providing probably more than 1.5 spaces per unit off street, the economics of these types are going to get pretty tough. Or the parking is going to start to compromise the quality of the site plan or the unit design itself. So important conversation to have, even as challenging as it is, to just understand that there's a huge market out there that's not being provided choices in every single market, right? Just great little cottage court project. They just share a little, little drive off the street, 1 space per unit, and the street provides the rest of the parking. It's not rocket science, but it's hard to do and a lot of times illegal in a lot of communities. Probably the most important aspect is that these types create community, right? There's a lot of people out there that are looking for this sense of community, whether it be in a neighborhood or in a pocket neighborhood or cottage court, right? It's just a huge part of the draw for these types of missing middle housing. This is one of the cottage company projects. They actually have a community building with a shared kitchen and dining area that functions a little bit like a co-housing project. So just a really neat model. So what sorts of things can cities and counties do? I think the thing that I like to start with is just let's start by removing barriers. Like let's enable developers to test the market for these types. And zoning is one of the biggest barriers. It's about sharpening the pencil. We do what's called form-based zoning. Don't get caught up in the name. It's really just kind of the new sort of rethinking of zoning to enable walkable urbanism, sharpening of the pencil. And what this is about studying a place and extracting the DNA of a community. What makes a great neighborhood? And using those building types that I just showed you as the ingredients for neighborhoods. And so what a form-based code does directly, I could talk for hours about this, but this is an example of a new form-based zoning district that we did for a project in Cincinnati, Ohio, that what it does is this is called a T4 neighborhood small footprint, right, back to that form, and it enables these types directly. It's not density-based, it's not FAR-based, it's not X number of units per square footage of lot. It's saying if you have a lot of a certain size, these are the types that you can do in this district. It's just getting right to the point of introducing these range of types into zoning. And I think we've done this all across the country, Beaufort County, South Carolina. We've done it up and down California as well. So it's just a really direct way to do that. Just Form-Based Code Institute is a nonprofit that I'm the board member of. Great resource if you want to find out more about this. I wrote a book on the topic about 8 years ago that we're currently writing the 2nd edition of. Just some really great resources out there. You can just find them by Googling. So who's building missing middle? So the most common builder all across the country, any community that we've talked to or worked in, is just a small one-off builder, right? They don't have a formula. They're kind of a little bit more willing to take some risk, sort of do something a little bit more innovative, right? And this was a great little project that we worked on up in Novato with a small builder called Urban Community Partners, a little pocket neighborhood, right? Series of small, detached single-family houses on a shared green space. The sad reality of this is he wanted to deliver 1,000 square foot units, but by the time he realized there was a $35,000 impact fee per unit, regardless of size, and a $40,000 utility hookup fee, his pro forma told him that he needed a 2,000 square foot house to actually make any money. So that's just the sad reality of kind of the regulations and fees out there. We're seeing single family home builders, even the larger production builders, they're calling us up saying, we understand the market's changing, but we have no idea how to respond because we understand how to deliver one thing. And we do it really well and very efficiently. And so we've been working with production builders. One of them's up in Salt Lake City, Holmes Homes, sort of family-owned business up there. They bought this lot in a master plan community, and we did this plan that integrated fourplexes, tuck-under townhouses, and then these great little unique, this was a unique type that we created for this project. There's a pedestrian-only mews that cuts through the project, and then these mews units orient onto that pedestrian mews. And so what we did is we took a typical townhouse and flipped it on its side. And so instead of getting a really dark, a unit that has no light right in the middle of that really deep place, we have a unit that's only 26 foot deep, so it has beautiful natural light on both sides. And so you can see the quality of the space. And this is entry-level housing, right? They're delivering this. I mean, you can't deliver for these prices in California, but they were unable to deliver any housing for under 240, and they're selling the smallest of these for 180. So, right, this missing middle is a way to get that attainability. That's the term the builders like, because I spoke at a professional builder conference last week. The apartment developers, there's a huge percentage of the market that's reluctant to buy that would have historically bought. So the apartment builders are saying we need to create a new creative solution for rental housing. So we're being approached by apartment developers to say, how do we integrate missing middle housing into a rental neighborhood? And so this is a project in Omaha, Nebraska, right? Not a super hot market, but this will be really innovative. 60-acre brand new walkable neighborhood with a range of 9 different missing middle housing types, right? And I think this will knock it out of the park when this gets built. And this is the center, you know, sort of historic kind of Main Street feel done with live-work units. And these are the mansion apartment buildings, right? Looks like a beautiful turn-of-the-century mansion. It just happens to have 8 units in it. And that's one of the 9 types. So, right, this is thinking very creatively about housing and choice and ultimately getting to affordability in 2 ways. Affordability by design, you know, can get you to a certain level, mostly in kind of the middle income range. And then there's sort of, you know, you can think about how these can plug into affordable housing strategies at a citywide scale with subsidies or density bonuses with developers. Then how else, this is the last point, so how else is the concept being used across the country? The state of Michigan, I mentioned them earlier, has a statewide place-based economic development strategy that has now been in place for almost 10 years. Sort of, it's all about reinforcing sense of community. So they have a program called My Place. So if you Google it, it's My Place, if that's the name of their strategy. It's using missing middle housing as one of the implementation tools for their state place-based economic development strategy. The other group that's really, really interested in this concept is AARP. And they have this age-friendly communities sort of initiative. And I spoke at their national conference about a year ago, and they've latched onto this idea and have interviewed me for their newsletter. They've been talking about it sort of at the state level. And so, right, if AARP is talking about this and thinking about this, they have a broad constituency that it's just really exciting to see this concept spread. And the professional, the builders, right? I was at a professional builder magazine Housing Giants conference last week. And these are the biggest builders in the country, single-family home builders. And they're interested in thinking about how is their business going to evolve to integrate missing middle housing types, right? This is a tremendous shift. And it's really exciting to see. So a few concluding thoughts. Number one, we launched an online resource about a year and a half ago. If you just go to missingmiddlehousing.com, we thought about writing a book, then we said we can get the same information spread and provide it for free online. And so we provided this great resource. It gives an overview of these types, sort of great links to resources and references for these types. So I just encourage you to go take a look at it and send us questions, comments, and your thoughts on what might be missing from that conversation. So the closing quote that I like to use, the Urban Land Institute, which is one of the developers' professional organization, had they did a publication called What's Next, and it's about 5 or 6 years old now, but there was a quote in that I love to end with. It's time to rethink and evolve, reinvent and renew. And I think what this is, why I like it so much, it's a call to arms. It's like whether you're a builder, a decision maker, an architect, a planner, a policy maker, it's about all of us playing a role and evolving the conversation about providing housing choices in our communities. And it's really, really important for all of us to step up and play a role for these, you know, the really, really sort of strong need for these choices. And so we know that the market is waiting. The real question is, will we and will our communities respond to this growing demand for these housing choices? Thank you.
In the walking neighborhoods, walkable neighborhoods, Is there a plan for commerce, or in particular like markets and shops, as part of the missing middle walkable neighborhoods plan?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the great things about these types is if you average the densities, even in a neighborhood that might be 80% small lot, single family, you get to average densities of about 16 to 18 units per acre, and that's what's been found to be a minimum need to support neighborhood serving commercial amenities. So it's sort of, you achieve that level where it does become viable, and it needs to be part, whether it be revitalization of urban neighborhoods or a small town downtown, the vibrancy and the revitalization of those centers is really critical. And when we're thinking about planning new neighborhoods, those absolutely need to be a part of the core of the plan in terms of providing walkability and sort of maximizing sort of the value of these missing middle types.
Well, you had a graphic up there that earlier that said 75 to 80% of households were single.
They will not have children
Not have
by
children. Thank you.
2025.
But I just wonder, like, where'd you get that data from? I mean, it seems crazy.
I'm pretty sure the Joint Center for Housing Study at Harvard is one of the best resources for a lot of that data. Chris Nelson is at the University of Arizona. He does a lot of that demographic mining. I'm actually in the process of writing a book on missing middle with him. But the Joint Center for Housing Study, Chris Nelson, those are two great resources for that information. That's nationally. Yeah, that's national averages.
Right here. Right over here. To the left. Yeah.
Sorry.
I just have a question. So are a lot of hipsters taking advantage of these spaces, like hipsters or creative class, or can you talk about the impact on entrepreneurship? Is it catalyzing ideas? You got developers, designers coming together, living in that housing. Can you talk about the impact on entrepreneurship and economic development?
That's a great question. And I think generally speaking is, right, cities are our greatest innovation. And sort of the fact that we can get back to creating walkable, compact, tight-knit places that kind of spur the dialogue and that cross-pollination of great ideas, I think is just a very basic sort of way that this can support that. But one of the types I didn't show is like a live-work unit that has ground floor flex space with a townhouse above it. And the great thing about that is it's an incubator for small local business. And if you imagine if you have like a couple of blocks that might have, a total of 15 or 20 of those, there could be some really neat synergy with people that are opening new businesses. And in particular, right, there's a big maker culture of like trying to just encourage that sort of creativity as well.
Okay, one more question.
Thank you. You mentioned before about working in greenfield sites and kind of on the margins. Any trends or successes in using what we have in city centers, converting large homes to multiple units, adding second stories, maybe changing zoning to allow for using the existing cities?
That is a great question. The first thing that downtown neighborhoods need to be viable is walkability to a center. We did a lot of work in Cincinnati, Ohio with urban revitalization of their neighborhoods. And part of it was like they're trying to get people to move back into or people are moving back into the city. You're trying to make the neighborhoods that they're targeting more attractive, but they had compromised their main streets by removing on-street parking and having regulations that made it really hard for businesses to change from a clothing shop to a restaurant or a coffee shop. And so what we said is the first thing you need to focus on is that center and making it viable. And then think about, very creatively think about, well, are there infill opportunities for new types, but how might some of the existing building stock play a role in providing these choices? Portland, Oregon is at the forefront of this. They've kind of taken the lower end of this missing middle with the duplex, the triplex, and the fourplex, and they're rewriting their zoning for their downtown adjacent neighborhoods to accommodate the evolution of homes into a duplex or a triplex. And, it's different historically. We've sort of stayed away from that because when the urban neighborhoods were being disinvested in, it was kind of the wrong thing to do because it sort of further added fuel to the fire. But as there's more reinvestment and interest in these neighborhoods, it's a really good strategy to think about to provide these choices and to do it more affordably, because right, you can adapt an existing structure more cheaply than you can build a new one from scratch. So that's a great question. Thanks for asking. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.